So welcome back to Third Age Reforged and to the next in the list of faction showcases, and we are going to be looking at the Elven faction of LINDON, which overall has garnered maybe a little bit of controversy because they are viewed as quite powerful, and I would agree with that to an extent, but I wouldn't say they're overpowered, more just that they are easier to play than the other Elven factions. There seems to be a lot more forgiveness within their roster. If you make mistakes, you can more easily cover for them when you have a LINDON based army for a few reasons. But actually, in terms of their infantry and, well, artillery roster here, which we're going to be looking at first, it's quite sparse really. LINDON don't have as many options as several other factions. They might have one of the, this might actually be the lowest selection of units we have in a single sort of round of these showcases, but that comes from a combination really of their more limited selection of pure melee infantry and the fact that they cannot upgrade their armour at all, which obviously plays into one of their more major weaknesses, which we'll talk about as we go through. But first of all, obviously the artillery, and both of which are High Elven versions of artillery. So we have the High Elven ballista here, and then we have the High Elven catapult over here, which again I believe it's just a sort of straight, they are slightly better in terms of accuracy I believe, but I'm not sure what the downside to them really is. But overall it is a little bit difficult to sort of differentiate them from regular catapults simply because they share the exact same unit models, and it's not so easy to tell, but obviously they will be used in exactly the same way as other pieces of siege equipment. The difference is honestly pretty negligible as far as I'm concerned, and yeah, as far as LINDON go as well, you can defend targets on areas of the field on an open battlefield more easily with LINDON maybe than you can with other Elven factions, but even so, the likelihood of you seeing artillery on an open field is very limited indeed. But now we shall move on to their infantry roster, which while small, definitely has a lot of very good units within it, starting off with the Harlingen infantry, which are very similar in many ways to the Eldar Makar from Imladris, but they are actually significantly stronger in many ways. In terms of their defensive values, their total defense of 24 is higher than the Eldar Makars. The attack of 10 is very similar, if I'm remembering correctly. But mainly this comes down, of course, the Elven units across the board are going to have higher skill on average than any other race's factions will have. But obviously they also have a decent shield value and an armor value of 4, which is honestly, obviously not great when you compare them to something like the Gondor infantry. But a significantly higher attack and higher defensive skill means they will trade very effectively with most other types of line infantry. It's really the lack of armor and the lower unit count which is what mainly counts against them. So in long atrocious battles they will suffer the same fate as many other Elven units of a similar type. But like with the other Elven factions, LINDON can certainly put up a very, very efficient front line, and the Harlingen infantry arguably the most efficient line infantry that the elves can mass up in the game, even more so perhaps than the Eldar Makar. 600 is honestly not all that expensive for a unit like this either, so a very good all-around unit, which makes sense seeing as it's really LINDON's only primary line infantry that they can bring at all. Moving on, however, we have the 4 LINDON pikemen, and pikes are something which LINDON can most easily mass up out of all of the elves as well. If I were to say that their infantry had a focus, it would certainly be in their 2 pike units. Imladris can mass up polearms, but not quite to the same extent that LINDON can, and also the Eldar Etar don't tend to be as good as this unit, the 4 LINDON pikes. The 4 LINDON pikes, of course, are essentially bog standard pikemen. They cost 600. Their stats are actually pretty decent. Their attack values get into double digits, which is something most other basic pike units will not see. So they are more capable at killing enemies than most other standard pikes will be. But this is essentially the good point. The bad point is, of course, they have significantly fewer men per unit. But obviously forming phalanx, bonus fighting cavalry. 600 is also a decent amount for an Elven unit which can be as efficient as this. But of course, unlike the Harlingen infantry, which do have a shield at least to make up for their low armor values, the 4 LINDON pikemen are going to be ripped apart by archers provided they're able to get their arrows into them. But yeah, decent basic pike unit that LINDON have. Moving on, we have the slightly higher tier pike unit here, which is the Mithlond pikemen, which, as you can see, they have a slightly higher attack. Mainly it's in their defense. Their defensive skill is significantly higher, so trying to wear them down from the front is even less recommended. Obviously they have more ornate helms, and obviously they have all the same things, but essentially they are just better pikes. They will last a little bit longer in a sustained melee fight. They do cost quite a bit more though. 150 florins extra is quite a lot, but if you wanted to go full pike and shot with LINDON, that is something you can do. But do bear in mind, of course, that while they do have a slightly higher arm value at 6, that is still not going to save them from sustained arrow fire because of their lack of a shield. And obviously this lack of armour is something which a lot of LINDON's units have to deal with. It is their most obvious weakness. But obviously we also have the Mithlond Swordmasters, which again have the same armor values. They have high skill, high attack. This is essentially the Lindon equivalent of units like the Hiri Lung from Mirkwood, or the Imladris Blade Masters from Imladris, and the Lothlorien Blade Masters from Lothlorien. I think actually though these guys are still, well, they all hover around the same sort of cost. You know, they have sort of gone backwards and forwards since I did the direct comparison back in the winter. But having a look at some of their stats, the attack is really the main thing that you look for when you have a look at these Elven Swordmasters, because their attack of 17 is very, very strong. But obviously, again, they share the same weakness as the pikes in that they can be ripped apart by arrows. But, you know, your opponent is only going to have so many archers most of the time, so they can only target so many of your units. It is maybe a little bit foolhardy to base your entire strategy around the fact that your opponent can't target everything. But even so, very, very strong. They're going to be able to kill a lot in a sustained melee. You're really not going to want to go into a melee fight with these guys with a unit of low skill. Particularly sort of cheap axemen from other factions are going to find themselves getting torn apart very, very quickly, and also basic line infantry. But units of higher quality will deal with them, and of course archers are the primary bane of these Mithlond units. Now, for the black sheep in the Lindon roster, and that is the Noldorin Guard, because they are really the only heavily armoured unit that Lindon can call upon. Now, I didn't put these guys as the General's bodyguard unit, although they are often used to house the General, because you cannot mass them up to a great extent like some of the other units like the Imladris Guardians from Imladris. But obviously they can inspire nearby troops, which is always good. They can frighten nearby enemies, which is also good. It means they can act as a real sort of centre to your line. Obviously they are significantly harder to wear down as well. Total defense of 32 is the kind of numbers you expect to see from Imladris, simply because they have that combination of defensive skill, a good shield value, and the armour, which is really a mainstay of Imladris most of the time. This is definitely a unit quite reminiscent of that. Obviously their attack is relatively similar to the basic units, but it really is that defense ability that they offer you. And they are often used to house the General, as I said before, but they are only single HP, so do bear that in mind. They will not go toe-to-toe with some of the other General's bodyguard units, provided both units are sufficiently backed up in the manner that they should be. The one unit, however, that is sort of more traditional General's bodyguard tier with a high cost and multiple HP and all that good stuff is the Noldorin Blade Masters, which are, of course, they cost 1200, they have multiple HP, and they are essentially just super elven sword masters. You know, all of the elves have got these two-handed sword units, but the Noldorin Blade Masters are the only ones who are a sort of hyped up version of that. The Arathalion E. Nanwaith from Mirkwood are a little bit different in the way they work, because they're two-handed spears, but these guys are just sort of traditional swordsmen in a similar vein to something like the Haven Guard would be, for example. But obviously their total defense is more reliant on their skill, so their skill is higher than most other sword masters of this type, but their armour is obviously lower, so 8 is not as high as you will reach for those, and obviously they don't have a shield, so you know, they will be slightly vulnerable to arrows, as most of the Lindon infantry is really, but their defensive skill is very large. There are very few units in the game which have a defensive skill equal to the Noldorin Blade Masters. Off the top of my head, the Dragon's Wrath Guildsmen are the only ones I can think of, but there are probably other dual-wielding units in particular that can match and surpass this. Huge attack of 26 as well, one of the highest. That is higher, I think, actually, than the Haven Guard, so that's interesting to see. But obviously they share the same weakness as a lot of the Lindon infantry that we've seen. But now we'll move on to a slightly expanded bit of their roster, and that is their ranged units and their cavalry. So slightly more units in this section of Lindon's army, which does make sense considering one of their faction focuses, and we'll get right onto that just after this first unit, which is the 4 Lindon archers. And again, a comparison you can draw to Imladris is they are quite similar to the Eldar Quinga. They have low armour values, so in a skirmish fight, provided they're sort of suppressed down with a lot of enemy units, the 4 Lindon archers will fall away quite quickly. But obviously individually elven units are going to have good range and obviously good accuracy, which is very, very effective. And honestly, as Lindon, you can mass up archers in the same way that other factions will try to do to you to cancel out your archers, and you will be able to engage in skirmish fights, and in certain areas that will work out, but obviously most of the time, because of your low armour values across your army, that is something which you're going to have to sort of make a judgment call on. But obviously the 4 Lindon archers, only 600, which is not that much more than something like a sort of basic human archer. But obviously they do have lower man count, easier to sort of kill off, but their missile attack of 6 does mean they will be slightly more damaging than units of an equivalent cost from non-elven factions for the most part. But other than that, they are just a basic archer unit. But here is where the first javelin unit for Lindon comes into play, and obviously javelins are another strength of theirs, and in a similar vein to the pikemen, you have the 4 Lindon and then the Mithlond javelins. They are both marines. But the 4 LINDON Marines actually, for the most part, are going to be a more common pick in my opinion, mainly because you can actually see that their melee stats are not that bad, and that is mainly because they are a spearman in melee, so they are a hybrid unit, and LINDON does dip into quite a few of these hybrid units, as we will see moving throughout their ranged and their cavalry units. And this means the 4 LINDON Marines rather can be a invaluable part of your army, because I'm sure most people noticed in the infantry section, LINDON don't have any shielded spearmen in their roster, which is something of which they are alone in with regards to the elves. Lothlorien, Mirkwood and Imladris all have at least one armoured, well, basic spear unit that they can bring to the battlefield, and these are of course very useful units for tying down your flank. 4 LINDON Marines arguably more so, however, because they do that job and they do it with javelins, which means enemy cavalry is going to want to be very careful about approaching LINDON's lines because of this unit, and primarily zoning out cavalry is going to be the primary work of the 4 LINDON Marines. I think killing infantry is going to be a bonus for them. 700 is a fair amount of money to put up, but for most LINDON armies you're going to see them, I think. And in melee they're not half bad. They have attack stats greater than quite a lot of human spears, but obviously their armour does let them down a little bit, but even so, good skill as well. Very good all-around unit, and one of the more solid all-around picks in the LINDON line, very much like the Harlingen Infantry in that respect. And then moving on, another spear hybrid unit, so you can see that LINDON, all of their spears double as other units as well. We have the Harlingen Guard, which are archers of course, slightly better archers than the 4 LINDON archers in front of them. Not only do they have a better missile damage of 7, but they also have a slight shield value, so they will actually stand up to enemy fire just that little bit better. 850 is quite a lot of money to put up for them, however, so you do want to be careful, but obviously they can defend themselves against cavalry potentially, which is always a good plus for archers to have. Very few other archers in the game can claim to have spearmen-like capabilities in melee. Obviously, we can look at the Hearthguard of Amon Sul for that, but they're a little bit different because they're a general's bodyguard unit. Still, you want to be careful about them in a skirmish fight, because there isn't really enough of them to go toe-to-toe with a lot of other factions if they go skirmish heavy. But even so, lots of good utility in a unit like this, provided you use them correctly. Now, the Mythalon Marines are pure javelins rather than any sort of hybrid. Well, I say that, they actually do double as sort of line infantry based on their stats. But they are not a hybrid unit in the sense that they will do very well against cavalry in a sustained melee. They will do okay in melee purely because of their defensive skill. You're not going to be able to go after them with any old rubbish and expect to beat them. It's going to take a unit of genuine quality to bring down these units in melee, and it's really this which gives LINDON one of their main strengths. Shutting down their javelins is very difficult, and obviously shutting down these hand-thrown projectiles when you get close to LINDON's line is going to be imperative for you to win. So LINDON do make that quite difficult for you. Obviously melee attack of 12, total defense of 28, mainly coming from defensive skill and their shield value. They honestly, you know, will be relatively equivalent to, in many ways, the Harlingen Infantry in melee with stats like that. But obviously they are quite expensive at 775, and you cannot mass them up to any great extent. So yeah, good unit, but again, if you want to go for a little bit more of an anti-cavalry approach, you probably want to go for the cheaper 4 LINDON Marines. But if not, if you're expecting much more of an infantry focus like you can get with Angmar, then maybe the Mythalon Marines will be for you. And of course, as with most factions, they will have, well, every Elven faction has got a ranger. Ooh. And for LINDON, honestly, it's one of the stronger rangers in the game, the Wardens of Elos Tyrian. They of course have a missile attack of 6, which puts them on a par with the Delupeng I Amunduir and the Nimrodel Rangers from Mirkwood and Dol Amroth respectively. Good melee stats as well, a defensive skill of 20, and this is because they are dual wielding in melee. They're obviously very low armor values, so again, the same weaknesses as any ranger. They're going to do poorly in a sort of skirmish fight, so you do want to keep them hidden from basic enemy archers, but of course if you get them into the right position, that body piercing can be lethal. And they are honestly one of the stronger rangers in melee, maybe even the strongest because of their high attack values and their high defensive skill as a result of being dual wielders. I'm not sure if I'd call them hybrid units as such, because quite a lot of rangers have got decent stats, but maybe I suppose you would call the Wardens of Elos Tyrian almost an assassin ranger hybrid. So potentially very good, but obviously people are going to be well alert for the Wardens of Elos Tyrian, because most people who play the mod know how dangerous they are. And LINDON do have a pretty comprehensive cav roster as well. Now the 4 LINDON scouts are a bit of an interesting point, because they are one of the cheaper cav units in the game, at least as far as lancers go. They cost 600, obviously a charge bonus of 10, so you could look at them as being an equivalent to the Noritino cavalry from Imladris, but I wouldn't if I were you, because not only can they not have their armour upgraded, but they will also tend to get ripped apart by arrows even more quickly because of their very low armour values. And they can hide anywhere, so they are one of these scout units which can hide. You can put them off on the corner of the map and they can spring their trap as the fight goes on. Maybe a bit of a risk, because obviously the 4 Lindon Scouts do pretty dreadfully in a sustained melee with other cav. They've got decent skill, but it's not going to be enough to save them from spear cavalry or melee cavalry. But still, an armour-piercing charge. If you want to get creative with some cavalry ambushes, then maybe you want to give the 4 Lindon Scouts a spin. Now we shall move on to 2 ranged cavalry. And first of all, we'll start off with the Wardens of Harlingen, which again, this is another hybrid unit. We have a Horse Archer Lancer cavalry hybrid here, and of course this means that they, well, I think they're Lancer cavalry anyway. I think, oh no, they have a bonus fighting cavalry. Silly me. That means they're Spear cavalry, not Lancer cavalry. I was wondering, their charge bonus was far too low, and this obviously comes from their stock as Horse Archers. Horse Archers tend to have lower charge bonuses. It's usually 1, however, so the Wardens of Harlingen are at least better in that respect. But being Spear cavalry means, of course, they can hold their own against Lancers in melee, which can be very good. Very expensive, however, at 1,000, and of course, against some of the more Horse Archer-centric factions like Rohan or Khand, the volume of fire that they will provide will be purely overwhelmed by those. But potentially, if you feel as though you are going to be able to press a good mobility advantage, the Wardens of Harlingen can be very good at this. They can help you against other slower cavalry factions with their range and then their bonus against cavalry in melee. But they are expensive, so do bear that in mind. You know, you cannot mass them up to the same extent that several other units can be. They also, of course, have a javelin cavalry, with javelins being a bit of a focus of theirs, and I think, yeah, the Mithlon Lancers. So this is the Lancer hybrid. So they are javelins, which means they can be useful in a cavalry engagement at range, and then of course once their ammunition has been expended and hopefully the enemy cavalry is largely destroyed, you can then switch the Mithlon Lancers to being a more aggressive unit trying to charge down the enemy. Armour-piercing charge, they frighten nearby enemy infantry, and again, a very good all-around unit with a lot of utility. Good total defence scores as well, so even if they're caught, they won't go down too easily. But again, they are quite expensive. A lot of these Lindon units are very good in multiple situations, but you do pay for that. Hybrid units tend to be a little bit more expensive because of that utility that they offer you. And of course, what faction with good cavalry anyway would be complete without a knight unit? The Noldorin Horse Lords are, of course, knights, which means they are all around and very, very strong. Charge bonus of 20, the full 20 there, armour piercing, frighten nearby enemy infantry, inspiring nearby troops, effective against armour. The one thing that sort of differentiates them from other knights perhaps is, obviously as Elven cavalry is, it's quite swift, so it's not going to be quite as slow as something like the Veriac Cataphracts from Khand, but also they don't have a shield. So that means they can be focused down by enemy archers quite effectively, even with their multiple HP. An armour value of 9 is not huge either, as you would expect from a Lindon unit. But their defensive skill is huge, of course. This bolsters their total defence to actually being rather good indeed. And of course they are very good in melee against other cavalry as a result of this. And honestly, quite a lot of other knights won't want to get entangled with the Noldorin Horse Lords for too long, particularly one that's focused around AP like the Franadine Nobles. So yeah, Noldorin Horse Lords, as all knights are, they are good at basically anything, and the differences between the knights are a little bit more, you know, each one has got their own unique niche, I think, and the Noldorin Horse Lords, they do trade in that shield and that extra survivability against arrows for being a little bit more deadly when the going gets tough in close quarters. Very, very good unit indeed, the Noldorin Horse Lords. And then we have a unit which isn't seen very often, which is the chariots, of course, the Mithlon nobles. The way they differentiate from the runic chariots is they throw javelins rather than use archers, so obviously this means they won't be able to skirmish down from quite so long a range, but they will be pretty decent when they throw their javelins. As I said with the runic chariots, however, it can be the sort of unit which can break an entire enemy line all by itself, or it can die without really doing anything. It is a big risk to bring them, but if you feel as though the fight could turn into a line battle, and the Mithlon nobles aren't likely to get bogged down on anything, then maybe you want to take a risk on the Mithlon nobles. Obviously, the name is familiar to anyone that played vanilla because it used to be a high elven infantry unit name. Their stats are kind of hard to read because of the way chariots work, but they do have 4 HP, so again, they're not going to die to just a few arrow volleys, but they do have a bit of a habit of getting stuck on enemy infantry blocks, so you do need to keep them moving, otherwise they will die off relatively quickly. So that is Lindon's roster, which is actually smaller than several, but there was quite a lot to talk about with a lot of hybrid units. So now we'll head back to the army selection screen and I'll talk a little bit more about what I think about Lindon. As with most elves, as we sort of take a cursory glance over here, you can see their lower tier units have got a morale of 15, and as we sort of head up into the Noldorin Guard, a morale of 19, and then another morale of 19 for their general's bodyguard unit. So elven factions, as a general rule, have the highest average morale, I believe, in the game. There is obviously a little bit of fluctuation, but as an average, the elves are the least likely to break in just general battle. Obviously, if you surround them and things are looking hopeless, they still will. But you don't need to worry about this sort of facet of the game when you comparing to when you play as the orcs or cardland. Now, actually, having a look at the ammo, I'm a little bit curious about this. So we have the ammo of 14 on rangers, which is a little bit reduced, and then sort of the ammo of 16 on their basic archers and 20 on their lower tier archers. So their ammunition counts are actually pretty good as well when you compare them to some of the other sort of cheaper archers from other factions. And LINDON has attracted a little bit of, I'm not sure if I'd call it criticism, but a lot of people think that LINDON is maybe one of the stronger factions in the game. Some people have claimed that they're overpowered. They do ride that line a little bit, I feel, but it's not for the reasons which I think a lot of people are sort of accusing LINDON of. I think the reason why, like, when you see LINDON perform well and you see their units working really well in unison and you think, well, you know, LINDON, they look a little bit powerful compared to the other elves. But I don't think this is because individually their units are stronger. In fact, if you look at some of the stats of their units, something like the Mithlon Swordmasters are actually weaker than their equivalents from something like Lothlorien or Imladris. You can have slightly more of them, I believe. Indeed, you can have 3, whereas you can only have 2 from the others. But I think a lot of the reason why LINDON sees a lot of success is that it's harder to make a bad army with LINDON than it is with the other elves. It's very easy to make a bad army composition when you play as Mirkwood, in my opinion, and the same with Lothlorien. In Imladris, you can maybe cover for your sort of shortcomings a little bit by having such a strong infantry corps, but even they can suffer a little bit, whereas LINDON, I think it's hard to, if you know vaguely what you're doing with LINDON, it's actually pretty difficult to build a bad army, mainly because they have all of the things you need. They've actually got a smaller roster than most other factions, but everything you need is bound up within several of these units, and a lot of this comes down to the fact that they do have quite a lot of these hybrid units. Hybrid units which can really add to their strength in multiple ways. They've got their spear units, which combine themselves with having good missile damage. You know, those javelin spears are a very, very strong part of their line. And the Harlingen infantry, you can scarcely go wrong with the Harlingen infantry. It's a very good solid frontline soldier. They have a focus on pikes, which means they can also hold up the enemy for long periods of time if that's what you need, both in a siege and on an open field. They've got a very balanced cavalry corps. Again, this isn't going to be as strong as someone like Khan's, but they are still able to put up a very good cavalry fight because of their hybrid units and the fact that they're able to bring a knight unit as well. They've got rangers, they've got good high tier units. Overall, I think this really contributes to how LINDON is seen. Now, there is maybe an argument to be said that this is a little bit too good for them to have in a way, because if it's harder for them to build a sort of bad army, then it puts them in a better place than the other elves. But I don't think they should be nerfed, really, mainly because, you know, if you nerfed any of these units, they would quickly become useless. Like, imagine if you were to nerf the Harlingen Guard into not being a hybrid unit. You would then have you wouldn't bring them then if they weren't a hybrid unit. You would just saturate your line with 4 LINDON archers instead, which is the more traditional pick. So yeah, overall, I can see why people like playing as LINDON, and I can see why people would sort of criticise them for maybe being a little bit too strong. But I think this just comes down to the fact that they are able to field good armies. You know, they have very difficult armies to break down, and a lot of this is bound up in their javelins, in my opinion, because as with Rudar are capable of killing off an enemy army very quickly. But they have to balance this with the fact that their infantry, by and large, is not going to be as strong as their opponents. Their cavalry can be a little bit suspect in places because there are gaps with regards to what you can bring. These aren't challenges that LINDON has to face per se. They do have to sort of overcome the traditional elven weakness of having a fewer total man count on the field. But even then, LINDON have bigger armies than the other elves. So I would sort of give LINDON, maybe not to the extent that Rune and Arthedain are for being good learning tools for new players, but LINDON are a pretty good entry-level faction just because of the fact you can't really go wrong with them as long as you build a somewhat sensible army. So yeah, I'm sure that J-Monster, because I know that J-Monster likes playing as LINDON, he might have already done it, but I don't think he has, at least not recently. He will, I'm sure, do a LINDON sort of overview, and he'll address these sort of concerns, I suppose, in a much more clear way than I can, because of course I'm not a developer. But suffice it to say that I don't think LINDON are OP. I just think that they are easier to play than the other elves, and the other elven factions can certainly win in just as convincing a fashion as LINDON can, and they do have their weaknesses. I mean, I'm going on about this a little bit longer than I would for other factions. That's only because I've seen LINDON criticised a little bit more for this. Their lower armour values are a problem that you have to overcome. You know, enemy archers are going to be a problem for LINDON, especially if you bring not enough shielded units. If you bring, you know, just pikes and these sword masters and then archers, enemy archers are going to be able to be efficient against you, very efficient. Even their cavalry, by and large, is not going to be as strong against ranged units, so you have to prepare yourself as Lyndon that maybe the enemy goes very archer heavy, and then you have to sort of chase them over the map in a very grindy fight, which might not be very fun, but it is going to be a weakness of your armies, generally speaking. So yeah, I hope you found this somewhat informative. Lyndon is sort of a faction that is being debated, I think. So I think the next faction, we're cycling back now to the Evil Men, and that brings us on to one of my personal favourite factions, the last of the Evil Men that we're going to look at, and that is of course the Black Numenorians from Umbar. So I hope you'll join me for that, but I'm sure that there'll be a battle replay in between then and now, so I hope you'll join me for both of those things.